My name is Dietrich von Seggern. I'm CEO here, and I'm glad that you're here with me for yet another talk in the OctoberPDFest of the PDF Association. And this time it's going to be automating Office files to PDF. Actually, we have pre-recorded this session because we experienced some bandwidth problems last week in my last talk, and we wanted to make this experience to you as smoothly as possible. So that means right now it is last week, if you understand what I mean. But anyway, I'm here still, and I'm prepared to answer any questions that you might have during my presentation. So whenever there is anything, just write it into the chat pod as usual, and I will answer it in this session. So, but anyway, now let's start with the topic, automating Office files to PDF. First question, why should you actually do that? Let's begin with a very short comparison of the two file formats. So when you create an Office file in, let's say, Microsoft Office, you are actually using an ISO standard when you save it. It's called Office Open XML file. It's an ISO standard in the same way as PDF is. So again, why would you want to convert from an Office file to PDF? When we're looking into the standard, into the Office Open XML file standard, we see it defines a lot of things about document creation, about how to save certain constructions of your Office file into your in the file on the disk. However, it provides little or no guidance for actually rendering. So how exactly would you want that data from the format and display it on a screen? PDF, on the other hand, it's an essential part of all current digital processes and of archiving anyway, so it is around definitely. But in the PDF standard, they're very much, the PDF standard very much emphasizes on how rendering takes place. So it's not just how to store files in the PDF file. There's not much about creating files, but there is a lot about how to display stuff that is stored in a PDF file. And then another important difference is in PDF, all objects are positioned absolutely, while in an Office file, lots of things are dependent on other objects on the same page. So as it seems, it's a good idea actually to convert from a more fluent Office file to PDF. So how could you actually do that? That is the topic of my presentation. And then you could say, okay, there is a very easy way, in fact. So the only thing that I need is a printer driver. Every Office file, every Office application can print. So let's just grab the print output from the Office application and convert that to PDF. And then with just one go, with just one application, we've resolved the issue for all the different file formats that are created by Office applications. However, this approach has many limitations. So first, when you have a character that is put to the printer, there is no need to tell the printer whether the, let's say, small letter A is a small letter A. The printer just needs the shape of the A. However, if you want to create a PDF, you want to know that this is a small letter A, because only then you can search for it, or you can only then copy the A out of the PDF file. So this is one limitation in the printer driver approach. Tagging, the invisible structure in a PDF, in an Office file, isn't exported to the printer. The metadata is gone. And then you have two conversions. You first convert into the operating system printer language, and then from there to PDF. And with every conversion, you might experience limitations of the destination format. For instance, some printer languages don't allow for transparency or big page sizes. So you would limit yourself when you always go through a printer driver. So this is not a good approach. So let's look closer into what we could do in order to actually use the actual file, the Office Open XML format file, and convert that directly to PDF. And then if we're looking at that, we understand, or we see that actually most of these Office files are created by Microsoft Office. And then in this presentation, we want to look into quality. So which conversion process works better than the other? And then, so how can we actually measure quality here? And then the easiest way, of course, would be if the standard would say how an Office file has to be rendered, then we could just compare the result, whether it meets the standard specifications. However, since that's not defined in the standard, this is not a good way to measure quality. So in reality, what we also saw in projects, so what customers experience is that the result is as similar as possible to what Microsoft Office would render on the screen. In reality, that is may not even be the right thing, so it may even be wrong what Microsoft Office does. However, it doesn't matter. In a way here, Microsoft Office defines the goal, sets the standard if you want. So we already now can say that probably with Microsoft Office we get as close as we can get to Microsoft Office. So that is clear. And now let's see just briefly how and whether we could use Microsoft Office to convert from an Office file to PDF. So what we see is Microsoft Office, you can control Microsoft Office via the .NET framework, and automation is therefore definitely possible. However, you still might have once in a while a dialog that you would have to handle. You have to stabilize the application because it's not designed for a 24-hour running, so you would have to measure whether the application is still healthy and otherwise just restarted it. And then you might want to run the whole thing as a service in a Windows environment, which means without user context. But all of this is possible. I'm just mentioning it here because this is something you have to take into account when you decide for a certain way to convert Office to PDF. But whenever you use Microsoft Office, you are obviously bound to the Windows platform. So if you want to do that in a Docker image or so, you're lost. You can't do that. What alternatives do we have to Microsoft Office? There is, on the one hand, LibreOffice, an open source Office application. And then there are standalone converters that are designed specifically for this purpose to convert from Office to PDF. Just once again, since rendering is not in the core of the Office Open XML file format, all alternatives will lag behind what we have defined quality in terms of what Microsoft Office does. So there will always be differences. But what we have seen in the past is that LibreOffice by now is actually pretty close to what Microsoft Office does. And that was the reason why I thought, okay, maybe we should just talk about this in the OctoberPDFest. And that's why I'm here with you. What I will do in my presentation, I won't cover all the standalone converters. There are various with different levels of quality and prices. But in this presentation, I only want to state that there always be differences between Microsoft Office and alternatives. And I want to look more closely into what LibreOffice does. Probably most of you by now have thought about Word, Microsoft Word, but in fact there are more Office files that we need to take into account. Most importantly is our spreadsheets here, but also maybe slides. And I also want to briefly look into emails. I won't cover the other Office applications like Visio or Project. But let's begin with text processors. So the main difference between PDF and a Word file is, as I've said, PDF places almost always objects independent from each other, absolutely on the page, while a Word of Writer, LibreOffice Writer, is a reflowable format, which means one line of text, the positioning of one line of text depends on the previous text in the file. Which also means, as a side note, that PDF rendering is much faster, at least if you have longer documents with, let's say, hundreds of pages. If you then jump to 150, page 150 in a Word file, Word would have to create all the previous pages. This is not the case in PDF. But that's not the core of this presentation. But what I want to say is there is, as I've said, there is in a reflowable format. It depends on the size of the document positioning. And over time, there might be differences between applications. And therefore, I first want to look at a somewhat longer document. It is in Microsoft Word, a 267 pages document. It doesn't matter, it's some document from United Nations. But we already see when we open the very same file in LibreOffice that out of a sudden it now has 275 pages. And that is kind of a proof that rendering takes place one text line after the other. And if there are many differences in rendering, over time this will sum up to substantial differences. And now let's look into some into PDF renditions from the very same source files created by Microsoft Office and by LibreOffice. So here is one example. We are now in Microsoft Office indicated by orange red, which is the main color and the logo from Microsoft Office on page 222, while in LibreOffice on the left-hand side, major color is green here, we are already on page 228. And we can also see that on this very page at the top in LibreOffice, there is a some text that is placed on this page from a previous page, which in Microsoft Office is on the previous page. And that leads to the situation where at the bottom of the page there is another table which still has enough space in Microsoft Office but doesn't in LibreOffice. So this is a typical difference that you see when you use LibreOffice instead of Microsoft Office. A few more examples here. We have a table on a previous page, and in Microsoft Office we just have one more row on the page than in LibreOffice. Another example here, we have a table at the top of the screen here with 3 footnotes. But in LibreOffice there is only enough space for 2 of them, which means that the 3rd footnote goes to the next page. There the header of the table is repeated, so it's not just out of context, but obviously it's more nice to look at the result from Microsoft Office, the application with which this table actually has been created. Probably the designer would have created it in a different way if he would have worked with LibreOffice. Or here another example, just a simple formula that is positioned more nicely in Microsoft Office. Or here where we have an additional line break in LibreOffice. But there are also very complex things, like here some vector graphics. It's not images, it's vector graphics, so you can modify these graphics in the Office application. And I couldn't find any differences on even those complex stuff here. So to maybe summarize this, there aren't any known real issues with, not just in this file, but in general with LibreOffice. Content in general is there, so you won't experience missing text or missing objects at all, and nothing is really wrong. However, in positioning of objects, there are differences. And that might be the very first takeaway of our brief analysis here. Let's now look into not just page objects and pages, but also into additional objects. Tagging. So an invisible structure that defines whether a headline, what is a headline, a table, what is a table cell, and so forth. And in the analysis, there are differences, but there are no major differences. So tagging structure is, if the Office file is prepared nicely, then the tagging structure in general is correct in both applications. And there is a difference with annotations. So you have in your Word file or Writer file an annotation, as we see here in the upper right, for instance. When you convert that with Microsoft, the annotations will be flattened into the page content. They are then regular page objects in a PDF file. However, in LibreOffice, you can convert them into real PDF annotations, which in some applications might be more nice. A general problem with any of the two applications is that in case you have a missing font, so the one who has created a PDF file was using a particular font that is not present on the system where the file is being converted. In this example here, it's a Zapfino at the top of the page, and below I have, just as a comparison, placed the very same text as an image. When we convert that with either Microsoft or LibreOffice, the text is converted into, the font is changed into something that is available on the system. And from our point of view, bad thing is that this just happens silently. So without any extra work, you wouldn't really recognize this. And from our point of view, in an automated conversion, this is a serious problem. Let's move to the next topic, spreadsheets. So yeah, we all know spreadsheets. When we look at spreadsheets from the outside, in the context of PDF conversion, we first see, compared to what a text processor has, there is not really a document. If we define a document, it has something like a page with certain dimensions. We see a spreadsheet doesn't really have that. So it's just in theory, arbitrary number of cells next to each other. But in general, conversion works. And there aren't really big differences between the two applications in our tests. There is one when we are looking at additional information, in this here tagging. The tagging result in LibreOffice is really weak, so it's only a smaller part of the information that is tagged at all, and then it is more simply tagged as paragraphs, while on the very same, from the very same source file here, the Microsoft Office, which is a simple structure. So you won't get from a complex table with merged cells or so, you wouldn't also from Microsoft Office get a proper tagging result, but for a simple table that works actually quite well. With annotations, we have the same here. On the left-hand side, we see an Excel spreadsheet with a comment, and then when we use LibreOffice, that comment shows up as a PDF comment, while when we are using Microsoft Office, that comment is missing altogether. But that is what I think is the most important problem when you convert a spreadsheet to PDF. And if you don't do anything, you will often end up with the spreadsheet, a big spreadsheet spread out over several pages, which makes it almost impossible in a PDF file to understand what the whole spreadsheet in the original was about. So this is something you need to prepare better when you convert to PDF. And in the end of this presentation, I will talk a little bit about our product, and then just as an example, you will see how that actually could work. Another serious problem is that text might sometimes during conversion, maybe you're using a slightly different font or so, it might be just a little longer than the text in the original, and in default text or cell mode, then Excel but LibreOffice as well will convert that with hashes, as you can see here in the screenshot, and that obviously you're not able to see what was there in the cell in the first place. So far on spreadsheets, then just a brief look at slides. Slides have pages. Most objects are positioned absolutely, so this looks as if it is good for conversion, and in fact it is. However, neither of the two programs that we're comparing does anything about tagging or metadata or layout templates, so create PDF files and with presenter notes or as a handout, and neither does they support slide transitions. So in PDF, in theory, you can have slide transitions, but it's impossible to convert that from your, let's say, PowerPoint to PDF. But yeah, from my point of view, these are more side notes, just something you might want to remember. Email. Email is a big topic of its own, so we can only very briefly touch on it here. There is no support for email in LibreOffice at all, but also Microsoft Office, where the application is Outlook. Outlook can't be controlled via the .NET framework other than the other applications, which means it is not really possible to convert an email using Outlook. So here, other than for the other file formats, we are bound to do a direct file format conversion with our own application or with something that is able to do so. And then when we look at email, email is not, it's actually different. It's more a number of information, and that falls into three parts. There is a header, and header has, for instance, the from, so the sender, the receiver, the subject, the date, and such information. And what you want when you convert that to PDF in general, and the industry agrees here, everything that is in the header should go into the metadata of the PDF file. In the body, so the actual text, you might have different formats encoded into the email. You might have simple ASCII text, you might have RTF, you might have HTML, and you might have all the three formats in the very same email, so that the email client that receives the file decides which version, which format it uses. What you would do when you convert that thing to PDF, you would use the most richest. So if there is HTML, you would use HTML, which brings me to the next question, what to do with externally referenced images. Either load them, but then of course you rely on the fact that they are available and still there, and also this will make your result much bigger. Just a question you need to answer when you convert email to PDF. And then of course attachments open an endless world of different file formats. And then you have to decide what you want to do with the attachments, whether you want to embed them into the result PDF, whether if you want to convert them to PDF if possible, and then maybe embed two attachments, original one and the PDF rendition. and so forth. So there are several things to take into account here. And then just one thing I want to mention, there are certain attachments that have a special meaning when they are exchanged via email. So for instance, calendar invitation or vCard files. And of course, an XML file, you could just create a text XML rendition of it, but usually that is not what you want to see. As a summary, let's say for text processors, in general, if it's just about content, it doesn't make a big difference whether you use Microsoft Word or LibreOffice Writer. Yes, no content is missing. However, if you want to have the same positioning and the same reflow, then you need to use Microsoft. With spreadsheets, we have good results in both cases, but we have some general problems, mostly the pagination problem. With slides, also good results in both cases, but additional information like tagging or metadata is missing. And with email, we have several questions. So we've just raised a couple of questions that need to be answered so far. So now that we have looked into Office conversion to PDF in a more theoretical approach and at the different applications and understood a little bit what is important and what we have to look at when it comes to particular applications, let's have a look at one of such applications which happens to be ours from Callas Software, and which happens to have the name callas-pdfaPilot. So I just briefly want to go over all the parameters of this application so that you get some feeling about what you can control from the outside when it comes to Office to PDF or PDFA conversion. So what you can do is you can select the application. So you can say, I want to use Microsoft Office, of course only on Windows, or LibreOffice. And what the application, what pdfaPilot does, it creates an as rich as possible intermediate PDF result and then takes that result and changes it on the PDF side, because there we have more control about what's going on. And that means if you would do so, and if we publish a new version, for instance, of pdfaPilot that supports the brand new pdfA4 standard, then from that moment on, you're able to convert your Office file into pdfA4. And then what the application also does, it gives you the option to embed the original file into the Office result. A few more things that we found in the past 7 years when we developed this stuff important. We've entered a solution that allows you to log font substitutions so that this doesn't happen silently. So it's possible to log it to react on it. So for instance, to throw the result away and instead give an error. You can control whether you would want to update dynamic fields in text processors. So these are parameters here for text processing, for text processor files from Microsoft Word or Writer. You can control the image resolution, and you control whether you want comments or not in the result. With spreadsheets, I've mentioned a few problems here. You can set up the conversion that it always creates one PDF page per table, per spreadsheet table. You can say, make all hidden columns visible. So in this example here, you see that right after column A, there comes column D, and then you can make B and C visible again. And then it's possible to shrink content so that it fits into the cell, so that you avoid the hashes in a result if the text should be longer. And for email, it allows you to control whether remote content is taken into account. It allows you to use templates. Here we have one from Microsoft Office, Outlook, and Apple Mail. It allows you to deal with the way attachments are handled, whether they are embedded and in original format or converted, and all header fields are put into the PDF header information, to the PDF metadata. So thanks for being here with me. I hope that that you can take away something from this general look into Office to PDF conversion. And I will stay here in the call and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Yes, hello. This is Dietrich again, now live from Berlin. Yeah, there were some questions and I want to briefly get over them. I hope you can hear me well. So one of the questions was related to font substitution. So the question was, does Microsoft Word allow for specifying rules for font substitution? And similarly, there was a question whether LibreOffice also allows for font substitution. So yes, both applications do font substitution. So if an Office file, Word file, uses a font that is not available during conversion, it would be substituted. However, you don't have any control about what font is used. So I mean, in Microsoft Word, it's usually a Calibri font. I think, as far as I remember, in LibreOffice it was, I think it was Times, but I'm not sure. But you just don't know what's going on. So, and then the only thing that you can do is you can, if your application that does a conversion allows you to log that, then you can log that a font substitution has taken place. Okay, then let me see. One question was how many files we have analyzed. So the answer there is it's not, and whether this is based on an official test corpus. It's not. So it's more findings from what we experience from in projects with customers, and more importantly, what our OEM customers. So actually, most users of our application are using the software via OEM customers, and much of the input is coming from there. And then one more question. Yeah, that was also again related to fonts, whether Microsoft Office Word, whether that file format allows for embedding fonts. No, it does not, and that is the reason why the application has to use substitution.